This is a footnote to page 8 of A Biography of Ordinary Man. In the last paragraph on page 8, Laruelle begins, "But this man, it will be objected, does he exist?" So far, Laruelle's procedure has been methodologically impeccable. He makes a conceptual leap, a counter-inductive leap from what he identifies as not just the dominant but virtually the only paradigm of the last 2,500 years of Greco-unitary thought, and he has to make a counter-inductive leap because induction based on experience is not going to give us an alternative by which to evaluate the reigning paradigm. All the experience that we may have is, up to the point of the production of an alternative, all the experience is contaminated by the paradigm. So all the experience is, to that extent, already pre-oriented, selected, pre-theorized to validate at least the terms of the paradigm, even if individual theses at more or less levels of generality or abstraction can be invalidated by empirical experience and experiment. The experiences and experiments are set up nonetheless to validate at least the theoretical language of the paradigm. So Laruelle makes a conceptual leap. He poses from the beginning man, the real, the absolute, and then by virtue as minorities, as multiplicities, as dispersions, and by means of that new, we could call it an axiom, because it's the first point in the new paradigm. By means of that new paradigm, because he deduces all sorts of theorems, as he calls them, from this axiomatic starting point, by means of this, he's able to show up all sorts of problems, prejudices, incoherences within the reigning paradigm. And then at last, he comes to the objection, okay, Laruelle, that's really good. You've shown that there are all sorts of problems within the paradigm, but what have you got in its place? The age-old question, if you critique something and you don't have a concrete alternative proposition, the critique will be without real impact and real force. It can impel people to make little adjustments, ad hoc adaptations, but it can't really convince people to make radical changes. So the requirement comes up, what have you got to replace or to exist alongside the reigning paradigm? What have you got? Because Laruelle shows his critique in the pages up to now. What have you got other than a purely formal system, a purely formal argument? You can go a long way with a formal system. You can show all the incoherencies and inelegancies and over complexities of the reigning paradigm, but there comes a point when you must show that your new paradigm is validated by appropriate tests. So we see that in the history of science. Copernicus made a criticism of the Ptolemaic model, but he presented his own Copernican system as just a formalism. It was somehow, for some reason, easier to use, more practical, simpler. So it was put forward, maybe this was a ruse, but the Copernican hypothesis was put forward as a mere instrumental hypothesis, and the reality of the cosmos was supposed to be said by the Ptolemaic cosmology. When Galileo took up the Copernican hypothesis, the demand was made, and this time he accepted the demand, to provide experimental evidence that this new heliocentric system was more than a formalism, but was validated by experience. Later on, when Einstein put forward general relativity, once again, the demand was put up to, after several years, to find a concrete validation, hence Eddington's expedition to measure the bending of light near the sun's disk that was given its opportunity by the solar eclipse. And it was only after that, which was a show than a real, totally valid experimental protocol. But after that, more effort, energy, and time could be invested in research on general relativity, and many more experimental validations, more convincing and more interconnected, could be produced afterwards. So this is a perfectly reasonable demand, and has come up often in the history of science. So Laruelle accepts that. He says, but this man, it will be objected, does he exist? And his argument is a little concise, but his argument is that basically what we have in the development of contemporary philosophy and the contemporary human sciences is the disappearance of man behind a set of sometimes compatible, sometimes incompatible universal predicates. So you've got something analogous to what has been called the disappearance theory of mind, which will be one concrete case of Laruelle's constatation of the disappearance theory of man. So with the disappearance theory of mind, people have proposed that once you have a sufficiently rich neuroscience, you don't need to explain mental phenomena and the mind itself in terms of material phenomena. You just leave all talk of mind and mental phenomena in the rubbish heap. You don't need it anymore. So mind disappears as an explanatory concept or as a phenomenon to be explained within a suitably advanced scientific theory. That's within neurobiology, which for Laruelle counts as a human science. In the other human sciences as well, in linguistics, in sociology, in anthropology, ethnology, you get a similar dissolution, deconstruction and dissolution of man to the point that man disappears and all talk of man just becomes a folk psychology, a folk theory that because we've been unable to replace all our linguistic habits and our mental habits with the most advanced scientific and structural theories, we still make use of this old school talk about having a mind, being a subject, being a human. So that's the disappearance theory of man. And Laruelle's point is that, okay, you've made a convincing argument for the dissolution of the self. There's no self for Laruelle. That's why he can say later, Laruelle does not exist. But you need the subject of science, for example. That science cannot incorporate the subject. So we're talking mainly about the human sciences and those sciences that are on the border between physical and human sciences. These sciences cannot incorporate or explain or take as an object their very subject. All that they will do in that case is get an agglomeration of predicates, and so they'll get a possibility and incoherent possibility at that, because of the mutual incoherences of all the different auxiliary sciences that are each taking a piece out of the former concept of man and treating that. But you'll never get the subject of science. So the first thing is you need the subject, man, as real, as nothing but subject, and as absolute. So there is an absolute starting point. It's not self-evident. It's not the cogito. So there's no self. There's no me. So this is where Lacanian ideas can come into play. All these constructs of the human sciences to describe a self or an equivalent or a replacement concept, they're all in the imaginary, and they cannot, by the very definition and constitution of these sciences, they cannot include the subject as real inside them. So you need, for Laruelle, as for Lacan, the subject as absolute. Lacan will call that the cogito for some reason, but I think that's a minor point of difference. And so Laruelle's point is that we already know this. If we take the leap, the transcendental leap that he's proposing, the transcendental leap is not just a conceptual leap, but is an experiential leap. That's what he says already, but maybe we didn't realize the scope of what he was saying when he said that the order of theorems in the book, the linear order, is also the linear order of experiences. So if there's a conceptual leap, there's also an experiential leap into man at the same time. So he's appealing to experience, just not the manufacture of experience that is going on within society, within ideology, and within the human sciences.